It is April 23rd, 2025. And while the Trump administration is in a position right now where it is actively engaging in talks with Iran and with Russia, and you've got Trump talking about de escalating the trade war with China, we also have to remember that we can't accept these statements at face value. Why? Well, because the US establishment is much bigger than just the current administration of the moment. They have plans for war with Iran and Russia and China that go back years. They have a number of policy papers that talk about exactly the way that US foreign policy is unfolding right now. And yes, that even includes a situation where the US engages in talks with Iran and then plans to let or to encourage Israel to carry out an attack directly against Iran, while the US acts like it's hands off when we all know that the US is not hands off whatsoever when it comes to anything that Israel is doing in the Middle East. We got into all of the latest. We talked about a range of issues, where things are headed, and also the role that the propaganda war plays in all of this with a special guest earlier. So let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Brian Berletic, a geopolitical analyst and host of the New Atlas. Brian, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Always good to have you. Now, I want to get your take on a few different topics. I know there's a lot going on, and in some ways, not a lot going on right now. But I want to start off with Iran because, as we saw, Trump went from threatening an all out attack to suddenly announcing plans for nuclear talks. And we have seen two rounds of talks with the third plan for this coming weekend. But we also have reports that Israel is planning an attack on its own and that the Israeli Air Force is running drills for it. Now, I do want to bring up a post that you made because you pointed out that this has actually been the plan for a while with a Brookings Institute policy paper from 2009 titled Which Path to Persia? And it has an entire chapter called Leave It to Bibi, Allowing or Encouraging an Israeli Military Strike. Now, reading this could have been written today, right? There's not much to convince me that this was written back in 2009 because not much has changed. But in it, it talks about the US, engaging in talks, making it clear that they're not the ones who are attacking, setting up a deal. Iran rejects the deal, and then all of a sudden, Israel carries out an attack. Is that what it looks like we could be building up to with what's happening right now?
Yes, absolutely. The United States is only creating this issue with Iran in the first place because it has sought to subordinate Iran for decades. It and the British had subordinated Iran. Iran threw off Western control, and the U.S. has been trying to reimpose it ever since. So we're talking decades and decades, and this is what every single administration, without exception, has been trying to do, including the previous Trump administration. Conducted an act of war against Iran, the assassination of General Qasem Soleimani in Iraq, a very serious act of war that only Iran's restraints prevented an actual war from breaking out. So the whole purpose of creating this issue in the first place is to find a pretext for war. The United States wants to frame this in a way that it appears to be the one acting rational. President Trump is the peace president, despite him burying the rest of the region with U.S. bombs, either with U.S. planes or Israeli planes. And then this whole narrative where President Trump wants peace, but Israel is thinking about carrying out an attack all on its own. These attacks are only possible if the U.S. assists Israel. In that 2009 policy paper, it says allowing or encouraging. There's a very distinct difference between allowing and encouraging. Allowing means openly greenlighting it and openly supporting it. Encouraging means doing it behind the scenes while you yourself try to distance yourself, create plausible deniability. And this is what I say all the time to people watching current events unfold. All of this is written in policy papers. This is something too big to just wing it day to day. These are policies that are put not just to one document, but to many, many papers. The people going in and out of these administrations and the think tanks, there's a revolving door there. They're the ones pushing all of this policy along. President Trump, President Biden, most of all, an example of just an empty vessel, just signing off on everything, not completely unaware of what is going on. But President Trump also, to a certain extent, he thinks Spain is the S in BRICS. So he's not a guy making decisions and coming up with ideas. He's just signing off on what is put in front of him. And I encourage people to find this document. It's for free. It is public. It wasn't like it was leaked or anything. And this is all the think tanks do. And they do it with such confidence because they know average people are emotional and they are going to be driven by their emotions, headlines, public statements. And that's what's going to send them into their respective directions. They know people aren't going to sit down and read an 170-page policy paper, laying this all out. And if you read it, it's very frank language. I posted some screenshots from the document. It's very frank language, admitting that we're going to sabotage the deal ourselves. And then when we do, we'll blame it on Iran and the whole world will think that they had a great deal and then they, for whatever reason, rejected it. And it's all their fault, all while the U.S. from the very beginning was just looking for a pretext for war. So that is exactly what the Trump administration is doing.
Yeah, and I'm glad that you bring that up, and I'll link the report below because it's so interesting to read this out in the open. And I think a lot of people, they look at someone like Donald Trump and they're like, he doesn't want war, right? He campaigned on the opposite of that. But as we've talked about before, when you look at the people around him, maybe Trump doesn't want war, right? Maybe he is genuine in claiming that, oh, he wants to see peace and he wants that to be his legacy. Well, you look at the people he surrounded himself with, and they are the exact opposite of peace and an end to war. And it's also interesting, too, I would also point to the comments that Trump is actually making, because he notably announced that he spoke on the phone with Netanyahu on Tuesday and said that they talked about a range of issues, including Iran, and that, quote, the call went very well. We are on the same side of every issue. So if you're in Iran's position, you've made it clear, hey, we actually don't want war, right? We're happy to have talks with you. And similar, it reminds me of kind of what Russia is doing, where they're saying, hey, we're happy to have dialogue. These are our requirements for a deal if there is ever going to be one. But you look at Iran and they've already accused Israel of interfering with these talks, right? They're kind of making it known that the U.S. is not an honest broker here in the sense that it wants a legitimate deal, because if it did, it wouldn't have pulled out of the last deal. But you also have Iranian officials in Beijing this week to brief Chinese officials on these talks that are happening with the U.S. They did the same thing with Russia last week. Iran is making it clear who their allies are and the ways in which they can retaliate if they are attacked. So how do you view this buildup where we know that the U.S. wants to attack? We know that there are going to be serious consequences if they do, but it's like the U.S. is still pushing for it anyway.
Yes, and I think for Iran, it's a mistake to claim that Israel's interfering in American peace talks. There are no American peace talks. It is the illusion of a peace talk, and this is laid out again in the policy papers. So what the United States is trying to do is, again, create a pretext and make it as if it was Iran who desperately wanted nuclear weapons. The most interesting thing is, if you read this policy paper, there was another one from Rand Corporation, I think also 2009. And again, it could have been written yesterday. And they talk all about Iran's nuclear program. They admit that Iran does not want nuclear weapons for proliferating it to non-state actors. They don't want to use it offensively. It is purely defensive in nature. It is a deterrent. And more than that, they admit that Iran would prefer not to even have nuclear weapons, just have the ability to create them. And if that could be a deterrent, they would prefer that than actually having a bomb. And when you're reading this in a U.S. policy paper where they are drawing up plans to unprovoked war with Iran to commit regime change and subordinate Iran to American interests, and they're admitting that Iran is not a threat. It's not a threat to the United States. It's not a threat to U.S. proxies in the region, including Israel. They're admitting this. And you read this, and then you can see that with very clear eyes just how one-sided all of this is, and how it is the U.S. driving this, and how they are leveraging people's prejudice. A lot of people just I'm not a supporter of the Israeli government or the military. What they do is on par with what Ukraine has been doing to the Donbas region, but just much longer on a larger scale. And it's an abomination. But people's hatred for Israel because of that blinds them from stepping back and looking at the big picture. And a lot of people will say, and you talked about Iran talking with Russia and China. A lot of people have to understand this is not the U.S. fighting a war for Israel because Israel's politically captured Washington. Zoom out, look at the big picture. This is America's war on multipolarism. Iran is one of the central pillars to this emerging multipolar world. The U.S. is waging war on Ukraine, or on Russia through Ukraine, but I guess you could also say they're waging a war on Ukraine too. And they're militarily encroaching upon and encircling and trying to contain China and Asia in the Asia-Pacific region. So this is not just about Israel and Iran or Israel and its desires over the region. This zoom out and see the big picture. This is an American war on multipolarism. The war on Iran is just one part of it.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point that you bring up, because you're right. I don't see a lot of people making this argument. And I think part of that is, hey, Israel is the most useful bad guy because they are a bad guy, right? They're carrying out an all-out genocide against the Palestinians right now, and they're happy and willing to do that. They've made it very clear in the, statements that they have made that have shown clear genocidal intent. And when you're talking about zooming out, it also makes me think of Syria, right? I mean, we look at what the US has done to Syria, the conflict that they intentionally created there years ago, the suffering that they took the Syrian people through, and what they've accomplished, right? They accomplished regime change in Syria. They didn't happen overnight, but it did happen eventually. Do you think that that is also kind of played into fueling the fire of thinking, hey, we can get Iran next, right? Look at all that we've accomplished. That's the next thing on the chessboard. And also kind of this concern that, hey, yeah, Iranian officials can be going to Russia and China, but do we have a concrete example that Russia and China are going to stop in and stop this directly? Well, I don't necessarily know that we do at this point.
I would actually say Russia and China not only won't, they cannot. They don't have the ability to do this. China does not have a military capable projecting military power to the Middle East. And while Russia has a very limited ability to do this, we saw it in Syria and we saw how that turned out. They are heavily invested and they have prioritized Ukraine above all other commitments. And this is by design. The United States has another policy. The Rand Corporation has another policy paper titled Extending Russia. It's all about creating multiple fires all along their periphery and forcing them to overstretch themselves so that they're not able to commit to any one particular area, focus on and put out the fire, create all of these fires, overextend them, and precipitate a Soviet Union-style collapse. Now, with Iran, I would say they're trying to buy time. I don't think they believe for even a moment the U.S. wants peace with them. But as long as they can keep the U.S. talking, that is time. I guess the U.S. isn't bombing them, and what they are probably trying to do is try to appear to the world to be the more reasonable party, to demonstrate to the world that they want diplomacy, they don't want war, which is something the U.S. is going to try to portray them as seeking. And we've even seen Israel strike Iran, strike their consulate in Syria, strike Iran itself. And we've seen the restraint demonstrated by Iran. Now, you mentioned Syria. This was also in the policy paper. They said a prerequisite for war on Iran is eliminating its proxies. So Syria was mentioned. Hezbollah in Lebanon was mentioned. At that time, Ansar Allah was not the player that it is now in the region. But if it was, that would also have been included in the policy paper. And they said, we need to eliminate these players from the board, isolate Iran, and then we work on Iran last. And that is exactly what they're doing. So again, this was never about, oh, Israel wants to take over Syria, so we're going to help them do that. No, this is Iran is a pillar of multipolarism. We want to eliminate all peer and near-peer competitors worldwide, and this is how we're going to do it. And we're going to use Israel to do this. And the interesting thing is, a lot of people say, Brian, look at that paper. They're all card-carrying Zionists who wrote it. Some of them, maybe they're dual citizens even. But even in the paper, they're not talking about using the U.S. to do this for Israel. They're talking about using Israel to do this for the United States. So again, it's very important because we're listening to public comments, and they're not telling us the truth, obviously. They're designed to prey on us emotionally. You can cut through that by just looking at the blueprint. What are they really building versus what they are telling us they are building?
Yeah, and I think it's a good reminder that going back to 2009, it's like not that much has actually changed when it comes to these overall goals. And when you're talking about a pillar of multipolarism, we're looking at a country like Russia right now. And it's interesting to kind of watch the Trump administration. Obviously, they have these talks with Iran. They also have these ongoing talks with Russia. And you see the Trump administration in this place where they seem to be, and I say this lightly, right? They act like they are trying to put together a proposal to get Russia on board with a deal, when in reality, the proposal that they're putting together is one that Russia is not going to accept, right? They're playing this game of saying, oh, hey, we'll recognize Crimea a decade or more than a decade late, or we'll promise that there will be no NATO membership for Ukraine. Basic things that, yes, Russia is demanding, but they also are not acknowledging some of the major concerns that Russia has put forth, which is, okay, if we have any kind of a ceasefire or any kind of a deal, what does that mean for the Kiev regime and its military? How is NATO going to be directly involved? Because we know that they are going to be directly involved. How do you view those talks there and kind of the hope that Trump is going to secure some sort of a deal, when if you actually look at the basics of what is being presented, that does not seem remotely possible at this point?
I have been talking about this since February 12th, when U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete, and I think the last time I was on your show, I also brought up this directive that he laid out to Europe. He said, you're going to spend more than double on NATO. We're expanding NATO. NATO is the threat Russia is responding to. And this is what Russia wants to address. And what is the Trump administration actually doing? Expanding NATO, not reducing it, not addressing it in any meaningful way, but expanding it. Secretary Hegseth told Europe, you're going to expand your military industrial production. You're going to double down. He literally said, double down on arming and equipping Ukraine. You're also going to send European and non-European, not American, European and non-European troops into Ukraine. Not under Article 5, because we don't want to get dragged into this. We don't even want that to be a possibility. You are the next proxies in line. We have fed Ukraine into this proxy war, and they are about to collapse. Now you're going in, and you will either freeze this, or Russia will have to make the decision. Do they stop, or do they continue and wage war directly against essentially NATO forces in Ukraine? And that's what he laid out. It was a Syria-style freeze, and we see where that led, plus a Minsk III framework. I've been saying this since Secretary Hegseth laid this directive out. And people said, no, that's not going to happen. Maybe Secretary Hegseth went off script. No, this is literally what they have been doing ever since. And people were saying, Europe is sabotaging Trump's peace talks because they're talking about sending troops into Ukraine. Secretary Hegseth told them to. They're just doing exactly what the U.S. told them to do. There's all of this talk in Germany about just emptying their arsenal into Ukraine and expanding their military industrial base, not their civilian industrial base, their military industrial base, to take over for the United States. Why? What did Secretary Hegseth say the purpose of all of this was? A division of labor to maintain American empire. The U.S. needs to focus on China. They physically, literally do not have the ability to deal with Russia and China on their own. They are assigning their European proxies to at least freeze the conflict in Ukraine and lock Russia in Ukraine so that they can't help Iran. They can't go help China. And then the United States will deal with China. And then at a later date, they will circle around and restart hostilities with Russia and Ukraine, which is what they have done over and over and over again. Minsk 1, Minsk 2. Remember, before even that, there was a deal supposedly made to stop the Euromaid and the U.S. overthrow of the elected Ukrainian government. That was betrayed. Multiple arms control treaties were betrayed by the Bush Jr. administration, the first Trump administration, and then that was used to encircle Russia with a growing arsenal of long-range missiles and anti-missile systems. And so this is a buildup to contain Russia, Iran, China, and eventually absorb all three into a unipolar world order subordinated to the United States. The special interests in the U.S., not the American people. Obviously, they're among the victims of all of this.
Yeah, and it's been so interesting to watch as, everything that you're laying out there is a reminder that this has been years in the making, right? This did not happen overnight. These policy papers were not written just because Trump got reelected or because Biden was in office. No, this has been across party lines. They're all one big party at the end of the day. And when you're looking at how Russia is dealing with this, and I know we've kind of talked about this, there's almost kind of been a fear that NATO would put forth a deal, that the US would say, hey, you know what, Russia, we're going to give you XYZ. We're going to make it look like we're giving you everything that you want. Recognize, these new 5 territories as part of the Russian Federation. We're going to keep Zelensky in check and on and on. So far, the US is not doing that, which is actually kind of interesting to me because it almost makes it easier for Russia just to say, no, we're not taking that deal because you're not addressing these demands. When it comes to the position that Europe is playing in all of this, because I do think that that's one thing that you've really been highlighting is that, look, there's not this massive break between the US and Europe, right? They want to make it look like, and I don't think that Trump particularly likes Emmanuel Macron or Keir Starmer or dealing with them. But as we're seeing from these talks that are happening in London today, the US is still very much working with its European allies, vassal states, whatever you want to call them. It's still very much using them. What do you make of the role that Kiev and Zelensky is kind of playing in all of this? Because Zelensky is still saying, hey, we're not going to recognize these territories. That's never going to happen. Is that part of the bigger plan to kind of try to wrangle Zelensky into a deal and then get Russia to say an outright no? Or is that just another piece to the puzzle at this point?
I mean that sounds plausible because you can see the buildup. You can see the U.S. is now talking about recognizing Crimea. Before they said no way that would ever happen. They've been talking about all these other regions Russia has absorbed into the Russian Federation now at this point under their own constitution, recognizing that. You said no NATO for Ukraine, but what guarantee could the United States possibly give Russia for them to ever buy this? The moment President Trump, if it was a genuine proposal, which it isn't, but let's just pretend for a moment that it was, the moment he steps out of office, who's to say it's not going to be reversed by the next person in office? And who's to say Europe isn't going to somehow undermine that? Does the United States have unilateral complete control over NATO? I would say yes, they do, but there's many ways they can make it look like, oh, it wasn't us, it was Europe. They let them in. So there's so many ways they can backtrack on all of this. And then once you have the European forces in Ukraine, you have completely frozen this. And if you corner Russia and force them to make a commit to a ceasefire, it will be so much more difficult for Russia to restart hostilities with European troops there in Ukraine. It's not impossible, but it would be very difficult on all levels, militarily, diplomatically, politically, economically. It would be very difficult. Now, you were talking about this developing deal that the U.S. is offering Russia without ever actually touching on the core of the issue. This is a U.S. war on Russia, and the U.S. is pretending that it's some sort of mediator between Russia and Ukraine. It's America's war, and they are fighting it through Ukraine. And the U.S. could end it at any moment. There's no reason for the U.S. to be fighting this war in the first place. It has crossed an ocean and half a continent to start this war with Russia. And as you said, over many, many years, this was since the end of the Cold War. 2004, there was an admitted attempt by the U.S. to overthrow the government in Ukraine. Then they overthrew the government of Georgia the year before that. They built it up and had Georgian forces attack Russian forces in 2008. And then they did the exact same thing successfully with Ukraine from 2014 up to this where we are right now. So it's so obvious what they're actually trying to do. Now, again, I hate to keep going back to the policy papers, but in the one regarding Iran. They are talking about offering Iran a superb deal. That's the term they use, a superb deal, one so great. And Iran would reject it because they know they're being lied to, but the rest of the world won't know that because of the influence Western media has over the global public. And it would look as if Iran was rejecting this deal because they were intent on obtaining, not just obtaining nuclear weapons, but for all the wrong reasons. And this is exactly what they're setting Russia up for right now. When we listen to U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio say, we're trying so hard for peace and they're just being so difficult. And if they don't agree to something, it's your war. It is your war. But he's saying if they don't agree to something in the next couple of days, we're just going to wash our hands of our own war that we started and we could end. And so it's so obvious. You could see it from a mile away. This is what they are setting up. I don't know how far they're going to go with this act. Like you said, they are pretending that there is some sort of divide between Europe and the United States. President Trump is in charge of nothing. So it doesn't matter if European leaders like him or not. He's not the one coming up with these ideas and telling them to do it. The unelected special interests that run both sides of the Atlantic are telling them to do this. So will they have Ukraine finally say, okay, we agree to everything, and they put Russia in this impossible position where they have to say, no, because we know you're lying to us, but the rest of the world isn't going to see it that way because of the influence the West still has over information.
Yeah, I feel like if Marco Rubio is the one saying we really want peace, then that's got to be the biggest signal that he does not mean what he says. I do not buy the Rubio makeover. I'm like, no, this guy has been...
Yeah, I don't want to interrupt, but when he's talking about peace with Russia, you could see on his face he's just barely holding back a smile or just outright laughing. He's lying. He's just lying straight through his teeth.
Yeah, it's like I think that in it, I was saying it when he made that comment about, it's not normal to have a unipolar world, right? We're all for the multipolar world. I'm like, this guy's saying what he needs to say because he thinks that is what people want to hear. And that is what people want to hear, right? Even the American people are like, you know what? We agree. We want the U.S. to be friendlier. We don't want war with Russia and China. Look, it's Marco Rubio telling us that. And alas, now we're kind of seeing his true colors coming out a little bit, which we all should have known because obviously he's been in the public eye and has been a very vocal proponent of never meeting a war he didn't like. Now, yes. Speaking of the other side of that coin, we of course have to talk about China because you have the Trump administration in this place where they decided that they wanted to escalate this trade war with China. They get tariffs up to 145%. And now you have U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent admitting in a speech that the ongoing tariffs are unsustainable, saying that he expects a de-escalation. Trump has kind of said a version of this. And I know that you've been covering the fact that, look, the U.S. is painting itself into a corner here, right? It's isolating itself from the rest of the world because not only is China not entirely reliant on trade with the U.S., but China has a lot of other countries it can trade with. Oh, and on top of that, Trump is also putting tariffs on countries around the world. So it's making the U.S. look more unstable while making China look like a very stable trading partner that countries around the world can work with. How do you view the current state of the trade war? Is there room for quote unquote de-escalation? And are we supposed to buy that at all if we do see the U.S. and China pull back on these tariffs?
I think people have to be, and myself included, we have to be very careful about all of this. And we cannot just say, oh, Trump is backing off, so victory for the multipolar world. That's very dangerous to do. A lot of people did that when the conflict in Syria froze, and look at how that ended. So I'm constantly warning people not to underestimate the United States. The United States has no intention of competing equally or outcompeting China. They know they cannot. It's impossible. And in many ways, these comments that you were just referencing, they're admitting this. But that's not their goal. Their goal is to knock China down to an equal or lower level than the U.S., not for the U.S. to climb up and above and surpass China. That's their goal. And they are putting the pieces in place to achieve this. This obsession with the Panama Canal, Greenland, this was all done openly with Russian and Chinese maritime shipping in mind as a reason for doing it. The United States, under the Biden administration, just to prove how this is bipartisan, it's not a Trump policy, it's not a Biden policy, it is a deep state policy that both administrations and all administrations before that have upheld. Reorganizing the U.S. military and the U.S. Marine Corps in particular to be an anti-shipping force solely to operate in and around the Asia-Pacific region, or they call it the Indo-Pacific region. The U.S. military buildup in the Philippines, politically captured. So you were talking about how obvious it is that the U.S. is unstable, abusive, exploitative, and how stable and sound a partnership with China is. I'm in a country that has a close relationship with China. I can see with my own eyes material benefits this has for absolutely everybody in society here, from top to bottom. It would be in the Philippines' best interest to work with China, but they aren't. Why aren't they? And the answer is America's capacity to target and politically capture not just one nation, but many nations around the globe. All of Europe, for example, look at what they've coerced Europe into doing vis-a-vis Russia, and the destructive consequences that has had for Europe. They're doing the exact same thing here in Asia to Japan, to South Korea, to the Philippines, and then further south in Australia. And they have politically infiltrated and are attempting to still to this day politically capture nations like Thailand, where I'm based. I just saw the US-backed political party walking up and down the streets for local elections. They're still at it. They're still trying to worm their way into every aspect of life here to not just convince the capture it politically and at a policy level, but also manage public perception, to convince Thai people, just like they're convincing people in the Philippines, China's your enemy. And the collective West, which tried to colonize you, or in the Philippines case, the US literally colonized the Philippines. We're your allies and we're looking out for your best interests, and turning yourself into the next Ukraine. This is your future. This is how you're going to fight and defend your future. And it's insane, but it doesn't matter if it makes no sense, because once you politically capture a government, they do whatever Washington tells them, no matter what the cost is for the actual country itself. Ukraine is a living, or I should say dying example of this. And now they're doing this to the Philippines. They have been doing it to Japan, South Korea. The island province of Taiwan, which is actually under international law part of China, they're doing that to Taiwan. So it is a huge and growing problem. It doesn't matter that what the US is doing makes no sense and is unattractive if you look at it rationally or logically. Their ability to politically capture these countries short circuits that. Doesn't matter. They're going to go and do it anyway. So this is what the multipolar world is up against. They have to, I would say that the multipolar worlds, China, Russia, Iran, many other nations are working together to defend multipolarism, but I still feel like there is a deficit in exposing and dealing with US political infiltration through media, protecting information space, education, political systems. This is still working in America's favor. And in order to really secure a multipolar future, the multipolar world needs to focus on this more.
Yeah, and as you're laying it out there, it's making me think of why the propaganda war is so important to them, right? I mean, we see it all the time. People will go to China and they'll post videos and they'll say, this is what life is like here, right? These are the innovations or the things that they have in their society that the American people could not even begin to dream of, because that's just not a reality here in the US. Our government does not care about us. They do not care about our way of life, our streets, or anything like that. They care about, continuing US hegemony, continuing to make sure that the US is the dominant power around the world. And we're seeing that in the way that our industries have been run and how we've seen such a transition towards furthering the military industrial complex and on and on. But it also serves as a reminder of why there's so much pushback against conversations like the ones that we're having, right? And we saw this with Ukraine, where it's like, okay, the push needs to be Ukraine good, Russia bad. Don't talk about any context. Don't talk about how the US has played a significant role, how this is, as you were noting, the US war here, they are the dominant factor. And you look at the ways in which this is still being implemented, and I think social media has a big factor here. Elon Musk is a big factor there, right? Of convincing the people in the West, you are free, you have free speech, you can say whatever you want, just don't pay attention to all of the speech that we're not wanting you to talk about. When it comes to the role that kind of the propaganda war is playing in today's age, and really this illusion, right? This illusion that we are the good guys, we have it made over here, we have freedom, and all of those countries on the other side of the world that we're actively bombing, they are the ones that do not. How has that been an important pillar, and how do you think it will continue to play the central role in what the US is doing? Because I guess in some ways that's kind of all they have here.
Well, yes, it's very powerful. In the United States, we know it's extremely powerful because you have huge percentages of the population that voted for President Trump and are still clinging to the hope that he's going to make good on all of his promises, even as he openly, blatantly, even bragging about how he's upturning all of them. But the U.S. propaganda war abroad, I think, is even more dangerous because I've watched it work its way into a targeted country, and I can see how it subverts the public against their own best interests. So they're cheering on a political process that is destroying their country, destroying their future. We watched this take place in Ukraine. That, like you said, it didn't happen overnight. It happened from 2004 to 2014. We remember around 2013, 2014, Victoria Nuland, in her capacity at the State Department, bragging about how the U.S. sunk $5 billion into Ukraine's internal political affairs to shape it and push it in that direction. And then convincing the Ukrainian people that somehow Russia is their enemy, Europe is their future, NATO is their future, and to just dive head first into the wood chipper, a proxy war against Russia. And we're watching their country be destroyed almost brick by brick. And look at the outcome. But that's what they convinced them to do. That is the power of propaganda. And this is why it's so important. I mean, the alternative media, I think, I do this because I don't see the multipolar world doing enough, at a official government level to fight back against this. I'm glad that there's outlets like RT, CGTN, Sputnik. I'm glad they're out there, but there's so much more I think that they could and should be doing. I also look at countries like, say, Thailand. There's so much that they need to do to secure their own information space. And if you talk to people, they understand that what the U.S. is doing is an obvious threat, but they don't see Twitter, now X, Facebook, Meta, all of these social media platforms that are based in the U.S., ultimately controlled by the U.S., including the content on it. And the algorithm is the unseen hand, the invisible hand that is deciding what people see and don't see. And so they think, well, we put our content on there and it's the truth, and the truth will out. And no, it doesn't, because the algorithm hits the truth over the head, clobbers it, drags it down into the alley, and all people see is the lies. And it works, and it convinces people, and not because people are dumb, because they have a lot to do. They're busy managing their own lives. They have a certain bandwidth that they can commit to following politics. They don't have the ability to do it full time like we can, which isn't even easy to do, as you know. And so it works, and they're able to convince people to work against their best interests. Look at the Arab Spring. That was artificial. They convinced an entire region of the planet to burn itself to the ground. And it's still suffering the consequences of that to this day. And here in Southeast Asia, Thailand's neighbor to the west, Myanmar, has been at war with itself for decades. This is a U.S. proxy war against the central government. And again, you look at Myanmar, you look at the Philippines, and you look at Thailand. Thailand has done a better job, but it needs to do much, much more, I would say. But you can see the consequences of failure and what it does. It is existential. And so having a powerful military means nothing if the U.S. can convince your people not to get into the tanks and jets that you paid for and lined up, or they'll get into them but point them in the wrong direction. The information, securing your information space is the most important I mean, information space is a domain of national security, and you'd be surprised how many nations still don't see it that way in their policy.
Yeah, the US has figured this out on a level that I do agree. I think countries around the world, they need to start realizing what the US is doing and how it's been written in the policy papers, right? It's there. These plans have been there all along. That needs to be common reading for a number of countries around the world that are dealing with the US and wondering why they're still being targeted, especially if the US is openly saying, hey, we want to talk to you, right? We want to make a deal, because as we've seen time and time again, that usually means the opposite, or it means that that specific country, as in the case of Iran, Russia, China, that the US is setting it up to be its next target. Certainly a lot at stake here all around. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Brian Berletic, a geopolitical analyst and host of the New Atlas, thank you so much for your time and insight.
Thank you.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.